Welcome, dear listeners, to the heart of 1815 London, where the grand ballrooms of Mayfair shimmer with secrets and ambition. Tonight at Almack's, a delicate dance between new money and ancient titles begins. Meet Isabella Fairfax, a merchant's daughter navigating a society determined to define her, and the formidable Duke of Ravenshollow, a hero scarred by Waterloo, desperate to save his crumbling estate. Their eyes meet across the crowded room, sparking an undeniable tension, a silent promise of a destiny forged in desperation. But beneath the glittering facade, what untold pasts will collide? What impossible choices await? Tell us, where in the world are you listening from? And what is it about historical romances that truly captures your heart? London, England, spring of 1815. The echoes of Napoleon's defeat at Waterloo still reverberated through the grand ballrooms of Mayfair, where England's elite celebrated their triumph with renewed fervour for society's most sacred ritual, the marriage market. The crystal chandeliers of Almack's assembly rooms cast their golden glow upon the cream of London society, their light dancing across silk gowns and jewelled tiaras like stars fallen to earth. The air thrummed with the whispered secrets of ambitious mothers, the rustle of expensive fabrics, and the delicate notes of a string quartet that seemed to orchestrate the very heartbeat of the town's most exclusive gathering. Isabella Fairfax stood at the edge of the magnificent ballroom, her slender fingers gripping her ivory fan with such intensity that the delicate mother-of-pearl threatened to crack beneath the pressure. Her gown of pale blue silk, chosen with meticulous care to complement her auburn hair and amber eyes, marked her as a woman of considerable means, yet she felt as conspicuous as a sparrow among peacocks. The weight of 1,000 judgmental gazes seemed to press upon her shoulders, each glance a reminder that despite her father's purchased title and newfound wealth, she would forever remain what polite society whispered behind their fans. New money. The scent of hothouse roses and expensive perfumes mingled in the warm air, creating an almost suffocating atmosphere of luxury and pretension. Isabella's keen eyes, trained by years of helping her father navigate the treacherous waters of business negotiations, observed every subtle interaction, every meaningful glance exchanged between the town's most powerful families. She understood with painful clarity that she was not merely attending a ball, but rather standing upon an auction block where her very future would be determined by forces beyond her control. Across the room, Sir Edmund Fairfax adjusted his elaborately tied cravat for the dozenth time, his pudgy fingers trembling with barely concealed anxiety. The newly minted baronet's face bore the ruddy complexion of a man who had risen from humble beginnings through sheer determination and perhaps a touch of ruthless ambition. His eyes, so similar to his daughter's in their warm brown hue, darted nervously about the room like those of a hunted animal seeking escape from an invisible predator. The cause of Sir Edmund's distress materialized at precisely that moment, cutting through the crowd with the fluid grace of a predator who had never known fear. Alexander Blackwood, the 6th Duke of Ravenshollow, commanded attention without seeking it, his very presence causing conversations to falter and debutantes to flutter their fans with renewed vigor. At 32 years of age, he possessed the kind of masculine beauty that poets attempted to capture in verse, but invariably failed to adequately describe. His dark hair, longer than current fashion dictated, caught the candlelight with hints of mahogany that spoke of noble bloodlines stretching back through centuries of English history. The strong line of his jaw bore a thin scar that ran from his left temple to his cheekbone, a souvenir from the battlefields of Waterloo that only served to enhance rather than diminish his aristocratic features. But it was his eyes that truly set him apart from every other gentleman in the room, steel-grey orbs that seemed to pierce through pretense and social niceties to examine the very soul of whoever dared to meet his gaze. Those eyes now swept the ballroom with military precision, cataloguing faces and assessing potential threats with the same cold efficiency that had made him a legend among Wellington's cavalry officers. Alexander moved through the crowd like a man accustomed to command, his perfectly tailored black evening coat emphasizing the breadth of his shoulders, while his pristine white cravat, tied in the mathematical style, spoke of a man who demanded perfection in every detail of his existence. The whispers followed in his wake like ripples on a pond. The Duke of Ravenshollow, hero of Waterloo, master of one of England's most ancient estates, and according to the most persistent rumours, a man in desperate need of a wealthy bride to restore his family's diminished fortunes. The irony was not lost on those who remembered the previous duke's legendary gambling debts and dissolute lifestyle, which had brought one of England's proudest families to the very brink of financial ruin. As if drawn by some invisible force, Alexander's gaze found and held Isabella's across the crowded ballroom. The moment stretched between them like a taut violin string, vibrating with unspoken tension and possibilities that neither dared to acknowledge. Isabella felt her breath catch in her throat as those storm-grey eyes seemed to look directly into her soul, stripping away every carefully constructed defence until she felt as exposed as if she stood before him in nothing but her chemise. The spell was broken by the approach of Lady Jersey, one of Almac's formidable patronesses, whose sharp features bore the satisfied expression of a woman about to orchestrate what she considered a particularly advantageous introduction. "Your Grace," she purred, her voice carrying the authority of one who controlled access to society's most exclusive circles. "Permit me to present Miss Isabella Fairfax, daughter of Sir Edmund Fairfax." Alexander's bow was a masterpiece of controlled elegance, neither too deep nor too shallow, perfectly calibrated to acknowledge Isabella's social position without suggesting anything approaching equality. "Miss Fairfax," he said, his voice carrying the cultured tones of Eton and Cambridge, yet underscored by something harder, more dangerous. "I trust you are enjoying your first season among us." The subtle emphasis on the words "among us" was not lost on Isabella, who recognized the polite condescension for exactly what it was, a reminder of her place in the rigid hierarchy of English society. Yet rather than cowering beneath his aristocratic disdain, she lifted her chin with a pride that spoke of inner strength forged in the fires of her father's business world. "Indeed, Your Grace," she replied, her voice carrying the musical cadence of a woman educated far beyond the typical accomplishments deemed suitable for young ladies. "Though I confess I find the intricacies of society's unwritten rules far more complex than any business negotiation I have ever witnessed." A flicker of something that might have been surprise crossed Alexander's features before being quickly suppressed. Most young ladies of his acquaintance would have simpered and agreed with whatever observation he chose to make. Yet this merchant's daughter had the audacity to engage him in what amounted to intellectual discourse. The realization was both intriguing and deeply unsettling to a man who had spent years perfecting the art of emotional detachment. "You speak as one familiar with the world of commerce," he observed, his tone carefully neutral, even as his eyes sharpened with interest. "An unusual accomplishment for a lady of your station." Isabella's smile was as sharp as a blade wrapped in silk. "Perhaps, Your Grace, but I have found that understanding the principles of negotiation serves one well in any sphere of life, whether one is discussing the price of cotton or the terms of a marriage settlement." The boldness of her statement sent a ripple of shock through the small group of eavesdroppers who had gathered within hearing distance, their fans fluttering like the wings of startled birds. Even Lady Jersey's carefully composed features betrayed a moment of genuine surprise before settling back into their customary mask of social superiority. Alexander, however, found himself fighting the unexpected urge to smile. When had he last encountered a woman who possessed both the intelligence and the courage to engage in such verbal sparring? Certainly not among the vapid debutantes who had been paraded before him throughout the season, each one more insipid than the last. This merchant's daughter, with her unfashionable direct, the ancient stones of Ravenshollow Castle rose from the Derbyshire moors like the skeletal remains of some primordial beast, their grey surfaces weathered by centuries of English storms and stained with the blood of countless battles fought in defence of crown and country. As the ducal carriage wound its way up the treacherous mountain path, Isabella pressed her gloved hand against the window glass and felt her breath catch in her throat at the sight of her new home. Gothic spires pierced the lowering clouds like accusing fingers, while gargoyles perched along the battlements seemed to leer down at the approaching vehicle with expressions of malevolent amusement. The castle's massive walls, built to withstand siege engines and cannon fire, spoke of a family that had survived through strength and ruthless determination rather than diplomacy or charm. Even the very air seemed heavy with the weight of history and the ghosts of long-dead Blackwoods who had ruled these lands with iron fists and hearts of stone. Alexander sat across from his new bride in perfect silence, his steel-grey eyes fixed upon the passing landscape with the detached interest of a military commander surveying unfamiliar terrain. The formal wedding breakfast had concluded hours ago, yet he remained dressed in his dark travelling coat, every button fastened, every crease precisely aligned, as though preparing for battle rather than beginning a honeymoon. His hands, encased in supple leather gloves, rested motionless upon his knees, betraying none of the turmoil that Isabella suspected churned beneath his aristocratic composure. The silence between them stretched like a chasm that no amount of polite conversation could hope to bridge. Isabella had attempted several times during their journey to engage her new husband in discourse, commenting upon the beauty of the countryside or inquiring about the history of his ancestral seat. But each overture had been met with responses so brief and coldly formal that she had finally retreated into her own thoughts, nursing the growing certainty that she had made a terrible mistake. As the carriage drew to a halt before the castle's imposing entrance, Isabella felt the full weight of her new position settle upon her shoulders like a lead cloak. She was no longer Miss Isabella Fairfax, the textile merchant's daughter, who could speak her mind and pursue her interests with relative freedom. She was now Her Grace, the Duchess of Ravenshollow, mistress of one of England's most ancient estates and wife to a man who regarded her with all the warmth of a winter morning. The massive oak doors, reinforced with iron bands and studded with nails the size of a man's thumb, swung open to reveal a figure that seemed to have stepped directly from the pages of a Gothic novel. Mrs. Pemberton, the castle's housekeeper, stood framed in the doorway like an avenging angel, her severe black dress and starched white cap creating a stark contrast against the shadowed interior beyond. Her face, carved from what appeared to be the same unforgiving stone as the castle walls, bore an expression of polite disapproval that suggested she had already passed judgment upon the new Duchess and found her wanting. "Your Grace," Mrs. Pemberton intoned, her voice carrying the authority of a woman who had served the Blackwood family for more than 3 decades. "Welcome to Ravenshollow Castle. I trust your journey was not too arduous." Alexander's response was a curt nod, as he strode past the housekeeper without so much as acknowledging Isabella's presence. "Mrs. Pemberton will show you to your chambers," he said over his shoulder, his tone suggesting that he considered his husbandly duties discharged for the foreseeable future. "I have a state business that requires my immediate attention." The casual dismissal struck Isabella like a physical blow, but she managed to maintain her composure as she followed the housekeeper into the castle's cavernous interior. The great hall stretched before them like a cathedral nave, its vaulted ceiling disappearing into shadows that seemed to swallow the feeble light cast by flickering torches mounted in iron sconces along the walls. Suits of armor stood at attention like silent sentinels, their empty visors seeming to track Isabella's movement with metallic disapproval. "The castle has been in His Grace's family for over 400 years, Mrs. Pemberton explained as they began their tour, her voice echoing off the stone walls with sepulchral resonance. "Every Duke of Ravenshollow has left his mark upon these halls, though some marks have proven more lasting than others." The housekeeper's carefully chosen words carried undertones that Isabella was not yet equipped to decipher, but she sensed undercurrents of family history that ran deeper and darker than mere architectural heritage. As they progressed through room after room of faded grandeur, Isabella began to understand the true scope of the challenge that lay before her. The morning room's silk wallpaper hung in tatters, victim to decades of neglect and the relentless dampness that seemed to permeate every corner of the ancient structure. In the library, leather-bound volumes bore the telltale stains of water damage, their gilt lettering faded to illegibility. Even the formal drawing room, which should have been the castle's showpiece, bore evidence of financial constraints in its threadbare carpets and furniture that had seen far better days. "The estate has faced certain difficulties in recent years," Mrs. Pemberton admitted, when Isabella's sharp eyes noted the extent of the decay. The late Duke's interests lay more in the gaming tables of London than in the maintenance of his ancestral seat. His Grace has been working tirelessly to restore Ravenshollow to its former glory, but such endeavours require considerable capital investment. The euphemistic language could not disguise the harsh reality that Isabella was beginning to comprehend. Ravenshollow Castle was not merely in need of cosmetic improvements, it was a crumbling monument to aristocratic excess and financial irresponsibility. The very walls seemed to whisper of mounting debts and deferred maintenance, of a proud family brought low by the sins of previous generations. It was in the portrait gallery that Isabella first glimpsed the true source of Alexander's emotional armour. The long corridor stretched before them like a gauntlet of disapproving ancestors, each painted face seeming to judge the new Duchess and find her unworthy of their ancient bloodline. But it was the most recent portrait that commanded Isabella's attention, a massive canvas that dominated the far end of the gallery like a dark altar. The fifth Duke of Ravenshollow stared down from his gilded frame with eyes that were disturbingly similar to his son's, yet utterly lacking in any trace of warmth or humanity. His face bore the cruel beauty of a fallen angel, all sharp angles and predatory grace, while his smile held the cold satisfaction of a man who had never known defeat because he had never allowed himself to care about anything beyond his own pleasure. His late Grace was a man of particular convictions regarding the proper conduct of a duke, Mrs. Pemberton said, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper. He believed that emotion was a weakness that had no place in the character of a true nobleman. His Grace, the current Duke, received a most thorough education in the importance of maintaining proper emotional discipline. The carefully neutral words painted a picture that made Isabella's heart ache with sympathy for the boy Alexander had been. She could imagine him as a child, desperate for his father's approval, yet constantly falling short of impossible standards, learning to bury his natural feelings beneath layers of aristocratic reserve until he forgot how to feel anything at all. The current Duke has proven himself a most worthy successor to the family name, Mrs. Pemberton continued, though her tone suggested that she was not entirely convinced of her own words. His military service brought great honour to the Blackwood name, and his dedication to restoring the estate's fortunes is most admirable. As they completed their tour, and Isabella was finally shown to her chambers, she felt the full weight of her new circumstances settling upon her like a shroud. The Duchess's apartments were magnificent in their way, with soaring ceilings and windows that offered breathtaking views of the surrounding moors. But they felt more like a beautiful prison than a welcoming home. The connecting door to the Duke's chambers stood closed and forbidding, a physical barrier that seemed to symbolize the emotional chasm that separated husband and wife. Isabella stared at that door for long moments, wondering if Alexander was beyond it, and whether he gave any thought to the woman he had married with such cold calculation. Dinner that evening was served in a dining room that could have accommodated 50 guests with ease, yet felt oppressively empty, with only 2 occupants seated at opposite ends of a table that stretched between them like a mahogany desert. Crystal chandeliers cast pools of golden light that failed to reach the shadowed corners where family portraits observed the proceedings with painted eyes that missed nothing. Isabella had dressed with particular care for their first meal as husband and wife, choosing a gown of deep emerald silk that complemented her auburn hair and brought out the golden flecks in her amber eyes. She had hoped that the intimate setting might encourage Alexander to lower his guard sufficiently for genuine conversation, but her optimism proved painfully misplaced. "I trust you found your tour of the castle illuminating," Alexander said, as the first course was served, his tone suggesting that he cared little for her answer. "Indeed," Isabella replied, determined to maintain her dignity, despite his obvious disinterest. "The history of your family is quite remarkable. I was particularly struck by the library, though I noticed that many of the volumes appear to have suffered from water damage. Perhaps the roof requires attention in that section of the castle." Alexander's fork paused halfway to his mouth, and for a moment Isabella thought she detected a flicker of surprise in his grey eyes. "You have a keen eye for detail," he said finally, though his tone remained carefully neutral. Encouraged by this small sign of engagement, Isabella pressed forward. "I also observed that the estate's account books appear to be somewhat behind in their organization. Having assisted my father with his business correspondence, I would be happy to help bring the records up to date." A systematic approach to financial management could identify areas where economies might be achieved without compromising the estate's essential functions. The silence that followed her offer stretched like a taut wire between them, vibrating with unspoken tension. Alexander set down his fork with deliberate precision and fixed Isabella with a stare that could have frozen the Thames in midsummer. "Ladies," he said, his voice carrying the cutting edge of aristocratic disdain, "do not concern themselves with such matters. The management of this estate is my responsibility and mine alone. I require neither assistance nor advice from someone whose understanding of such matters extends no further than the counting house of a textile merchant." The words struck Isabella like physical blows, each syllable carefully chosen to inflict maximum damage upon her pride and self-worth. She felt the color drain from her face as the full import of his rejection settled upon her, but she managed to maintain her composure through sheer force of will. "Of course, Your Grace," she replied, her voice steady despite the turmoil raging within her breast. "I meant no presumption. I merely thought that my experience might prove useful, but I defer to your superior judgment in all matters." Alexander's expression remained impassive as he returned his attention to his meal, effectively dismissing both Isabella and her offer with the same casual indifference he might show to an importunate servant. The remainder of their dinner passed in suffocating silence, broken only by the soft clink of silver against porcelain and the distant howling of wind across the moors. Later that evening, alone in his study, Alexander sat surrounded by ledgers and correspondence that painted a picture of financial disaster more complete than he had dared to admit even to himself. The estate's debts mounted like storm clouds on the horizon, threatening to engulf everything his family had built over 4 centuries of blood and sacrifice. The immediate infusion of capital from Isabella's dowry had provided temporary relief, but the underlying problems remained as intractable as ever. His gaze fell upon the military commendations displayed in their place of honor above the mantelpiece, tangible reminders of a time when his life had possessed clear purpose and meaning. The Battle of Waterloo had been hell on earth, a maelstrom of blood and thunder that had claimed the lives of better men than he. Yet in those moments of ultimate crisis, he had known exactly who he was and what was expected of him. Now, faced with the mundane challenges of estate management and the complexities of marriage, he felt more lost than he ever had while charging French cavalry positions. The memory of Isabella's gentle presence during dinner, the way her voice had seemed to quiet the demons that perpetually whispered in his mind, only served to increase his sense of vulnerability and self-loathing. She was dangerous, this merchant's daughter, with her intelligent eyes and generous heart. Dangerous because she made him want things he had no right to desire, because she threatened to breach the emotional walls that had protected him since childhood. Better to maintain his distance, to treat their marriage as the business transaction it was, than to risk the kind of emotional devastation that had destroyed his father's victims and nearly destroyed his father himself. The sound of soft footsteps in the corridor beyond his study door interrupted his brooding, and Alexander felt his pulse quicken as he recognized Isabella's distinctive gait. For a moment he was tempted to call out to her, to invite her in for the kind of honest conversation that might bridge the chasm between them, but the memory of his father's portrait, with its cold eyes and cruel smile, stayed his tongue and reinforced his resolve to maintain the emotional distance that duty demanded. The footsteps faded into silence, leaving Alexander alone with his ledgers and his regrets, wondering if he had just made the greatest mistake of his life. Meanwhile, in the Duchess's chambers, Isabella prepared for her wedding night with hands that trembled despite her best efforts to remain calm. Her lady's maid had laid out a nightgown of finest white silk, its delicate lace trim and flowing lines designed to please her husband's eye. Yet Isabella felt more like a sacrifice being prepared for some ancient ritual than a bride anticipating her wedding night. The connecting door between their chambers remained ominously closed, showing no sign that Alexander intended to honor the traditional expectations of their wedding night. Isabella stared at that door until her eyes burned with unshed tears, wondering if her new husband found her so repugnant that he could not bear even the pretense of marital intimacy. As the clock on the mantelpiece chimed midnight, Isabella finally gathered the courage to approach the connecting door. Her bare feet made no sound on the thick Persian carpet as she crossed the room, her silk nightgown whispering around her ankles like the wings of moths drawn to flame. With trembling fingers, she turned the handle and stepped into Alexander's domain. The Duke's chambers were a study in masculine austerity, all dark wood and leather furnishings arranged with military precision. Alexander stood silhouetted against the tall windows, still fully dressed despite the lateness of the hour, his broad shoulders rigid with tension as he stared out at the moonlit moors beyond. "Alexander," Isabella whispered, her voice barely audible in the vast chamber. "I know that our marriage began as a matter of convenience, but I had hoped that we might find some measure of happiness together. We are bound now by law and sacred vows, and I believe that with time and patience we might build something meaningful from this arrangement." Alexander did not turn from the window, did not acknowledge her presence with so much as a glance. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the cold finality of a judge pronouncing sentence. "You will never be enough for me," he said, each word falling like a stone into the silence between them. "This marriage is a business transaction, nothing more. Do not mistake necessity for affection. Your father's money will restore my estate, and you will provide an heir. Beyond that, I require nothing from you." Isabella felt the world tilt beneath her feet as the full cruelty of his words penetrated her consciousness. The man she had married, the war hero she had dared to hope might learn to care for her, had just reduced their union to its most basic commercial elements with a brutality that took her breath away. "I understand, Your Grace," she managed to whisper, the formal address cutting through the air like a blade drawn across silk. "I shall not trouble you with such foolish notions again." With dignity that cost her more than Alexander would ever know, Isabella turned and walked back to her own chambers, her spine straight and her head held high despite the devastation raging within her heart. Behind her, she heard the soft click of a key turning in a lock, the sound echoing through the darkness like the death knell of every romantic dream she had ever dared to cherish. Alone in her marriage bed, Isabella finally allowed the tears to fall, each drop a testament to the innocence she had lost and the bitter wisdom she had gained in its place. Outside her windows, the wind howled across the moors, like the voices of all the Blackwood brides who had come before her, women who had learned too late that some castles were not homes but prisons, and some husbands were not lovers but jailers who held the keys to cages built from duty, pride, and the ashes of long-dead dreams. 6 months had passed since that devastating wedding night, and the morning sun, streaming through the tall windows of Ravenshollow's breakfast room, illuminated a scene of domestic tranquility that was as beautiful as it was utterly false. Isabella sat at one end of the mahogany table, her auburn hair caught in a shaft of golden light as she reviewed the morning's correspondence with the methodical precision of a general planning a military campaign. Her emerald silk morning dress, perfectly pressed and immaculately styled, spoke of a duchess who had mastered every external requirement of her position, while her heart remained as frozen as the Derbyshire moors in winter. At the opposite end of the table, Alexander maintained his customary silence as he studied estate reports with the same intense concentration he had once reserved for battlefield intelligence. His dark hair showed threads of premature silver at the temples, testament to the weight of responsibilities that pressed upon his shoulders like stones in a burial cairn. The distance between them measured barely 12 feet, yet it might as well have been an ocean for all the connection that existed between husband and wife. The only sounds that disturbed their morning ritual were the gentle clink of porcelain against silver and the soft rustle of papers being turned. They had perfected the art of existing in the same space while remaining complete strangers, their conversations limited to the bare necessities of household management and social obligations. The passionate woman who had dared to hope for love had been buried beneath layers of ducal propriety, while the war hero who had once felt his heart stir at her touch had retreated so far behind his emotional battlements that even he sometimes forgot the man he had been. "The Pemberton account requires your attention," Isabella said without looking up from her correspondence, her voice carrying the neutral tone of a competent secretary addressing her employer. "Cook has managed to reduce our household expenses by nearly 15% through more efficient purchasing arrangements with local suppliers." Alexander's grey eyes flickered briefly in her direction before returning to his papers. "Very good," he replied with the same enthusiasm he might have shown for a report on crop rotation schedules. "See that Mrs. Pemberton receives my compliments on her diligence." What he did not say, what he refused to acknowledge even to himself, was that Isabella's quiet efficiency had transformed Ravenshollow from a crumbling monument to aristocratic excess into a smoothly functioning estate that actually turned a modest profit. Her mathematical mind had identified wasteful expenditures that had gone unnoticed for decades, while her gentle but firm management style had motivated the servants to levels of productivity that his father's harsh discipline had never achieved. The tenants spoke of the new Duchess with a reverence that bordered on worship, praising her kindness to their children and her practical solutions to problems that had plagued them for generations. She had personally overseen the repair of leaking roofs and the installation of proper drainage systems, using her own pin money when estate funds proved insufficient. The cottage gardens now flourished under her guidance, providing fresh vegetables that supplemented meager diets and improved the health of entire families. Yet Alexander observed these transformations with the detached interest of a man watching events unfold in a foreign country. He told himself that Isabella's competence was merely another asset to be catalogued alongside her dowry and her breeding potential, refusing to acknowledge the growing dependence that made him linger over breakfast just to hear her voice, or feel strangely unsettled when she was away visiting tenants. His nightmares had indeed decreased in frequency since their marriage, though he attributed this improvement to the general reduction in his financial anxieties, rather than to any soothing influence of his wife's presence. When he woke in the dark hours before dawn, gasping from dreams of Waterloo's carnage, he sometimes caught himself listening for sounds of movement from Isabella's chambers, taking comfort in the knowledge that she was near even as he despised himself for such weakness. The morning's tranquility was shattered by the arrival of Sir Edmund Fairfax, whose unannounced appearance at Ravenshollow sent ripples of tension through the carefully maintained facade of marital harmony. Isabella's father had aged considerably since the wedding, his once ruddy complexion now bearing an unhealthy pallor that spoke of sleepless nights and mounting anxieties. His hands trembled slightly as he accepted Alexander's grudging invitation to join them for coffee, and his eyes darted nervously about the room like those of a cornered animal seeking escape. "Your Grace," Sir Edmund began, his voice carrying a forced joviality that fooled no one present, "I trust you and my dear Isabella are enjoying the finest of health and happiness in your new life together." Alexander's response was a curt nod that conveyed neither warmth nor welcome. "What brings you to Derbyshire, Sir Edmund? I was under the impression that your business interests required your constant attention in London." The merchant's facade cracked slightly at the Duke's cold tone, revealing glimpses of the desperation that drove his unexpected visit. "Indeed, Your Grace, and it is precisely those business interests that compel me to request a brief private audience with you. There are certain matters of mutual concern that require discussion." Isabella felt her stomach clench with foreboding as she observed the interplay between the two men who had shaped her destiny with their financial machinations. Her father's obvious distress combined with Alexander's growing suspicion created an atmosphere of tension that made the very air seem to vibrate with unspoken threats and hidden dangers. The private meeting that followed in Alexander's study lasted nearly 2 hours, during which Isabella paced her sitting room like a caged lioness, her imagination conjuring increasingly dire scenarios to explain her father's unexpected appearance. When the two men finally emerged, Sir Edmund's relief was palpable, though Alexander's expression remained as unreadable as carved granite. "The second installment of your dowry will be delayed by several months," Alexander informed Isabella later that evening, his tone suggesting that he considered the matter of no particular importance. "Your father assures me that certain temporary market fluctuations have affected his liquidity, but he has provided promissory notes secured against his textile warehouses as guarantee of eventual payment." Isabella's heart sank as she recognized the euphemistic language that concealed financial disaster. Her father's investments had clearly failed, leaving him scrambling to meet obligations that could destroy them all if they came to light. The knowledge that her marriage had been built upon foundations of sand rather than solid gold filled her with a shame so profound that she could barely meet Alexander's eyes. "I see," she managed to whisper, her voice barely audible above the crackling of the fire in the hearth. "I trust that this delay will not cause undue hardship for the estate's operations." Alexander's laugh was as cold as winter wind across the moors. "Your concern for my financial welfare is touching, though unnecessary. I have survived worse setbacks than a merchant's broken promises." The casual cruelty of his words struck Isabella like physical blows, yet she maintained her composure through sheer force of will. She had learned to armor herself against his casual indifference, to find strength in the knowledge that she was more than the sum of her father's failures and her husband's contempt. It was during this period of mounting tension that Isabella discovered she was with child, a revelation that should have brought joy, but instead filled her with a complex mixture of hope and terror. For weeks she agonized over how to share the news with Alexander, rehearsing different approaches and imagining various responses, all while her body began to show the subtle changes that would soon make concealment impossible. When she finally gathered the courage to make her announcement during one of their silent dinners, Alexander's reaction was everything she had feared and nothing she had hoped for. His grey eyes showed no warmth, no excitement, no trace of the tender protectiveness that she had dreamed might soften his heart toward both her and their unborn child. "Good," he said with the same tone he might have used to acknowledge a favourable weather report. "An heir will secure the succession and fulfill the primary purpose of our arrangement. You must take proper care of yourself to ensure a successful outcome." Isabella's smile felt like broken glass against her lips as she absorbed the full impact of his clinical response. Even the creation of new life, the miracle that should have bound them together in shared wonder and anticipation, had been reduced to another business transaction in the ledger of their loveless marriage. "Of course, Your Grace," she replied, her voice steady despite the tears that threatened to spill from her eyes. "I shall consult with the finest physicians to ensure that all proper precautions are taken." As spring gave way to summer, they returned to London for the social season, where Isabella was forced to navigate the treacherous waters of ton society as a duchess whose marriage was the subject of endless speculation and gossip. The grand ballrooms and elegant drawing rooms that had once intimidated her as a merchant's daughter now felt like battlefields where every conversation was a potential ambush and every smile concealed a dagger aimed at her reputation. It was at one of these glittering social gatherings that Isabella first encountered Lady Vivian Ashford, Alexander's former mistress, whose beauty and sophistication served as a constant reminder of everything Isabella could never hope to become. Vivian moved through society with the fluid grace of a woman born to command attention, her raven-black hair and violet eyes creating a striking contrast to Isabella's more subdued auburn and amber colouring. The widow's gowns were always at the very pinnacle of fashion, cut with a daring that emphasized her voluptuous figure while remaining just within the bounds of respectability. Her jewels were magnificent, her wit was sharp, and her connections within the highest circles of society were unassailable. She represented everything that Alexander's world valued: ancient bloodlines, sophisticated beauty, and the kind of worldly knowledge that could never be acquired through education or effort. Isabella watched from across crowded ballrooms as Vivian engaged Alexander in animated conversations that brought rare smiles to his stern features, their shared history creating an intimacy that no amount of marital vows could hope to breach. The way Alexander's eyes lit up when Vivian approached, the subtle relaxation of his usually rigid posture in her presence, spoke of connections that transcended mere physical attraction to encompass intellectual and emotional bonds that Isabella had never been permitted to forge. "My dear Duke," Vivian purred during one particularly painful encounter at Lady Castlereagh's soirée, her gloved hand resting possessively upon Alexander's arm, "I have the most fascinating proposition to discuss with you. There are certain American shipping ventures that promise extraordinary returns for investors with the vision to recognize their potential." Alexander's interest was immediately engaged in a way that Isabella's practical suggestions about estate management had never achieved. "Indeed, I confess myself intrigued by any opportunity that might prove profitable in these uncertain times." Vivian's smile was as sharp as a blade wrapped in silk. "Then perhaps we might arrange a private meeting to discuss the details. These matters require a level of sophistication that not everyone possesses, but I know you will appreciate the subtle complexities involved." Oh, the pointed exclusion of Isabella from their conversation was as deliberate as it was devastating. A reminder that despite her title and her marriage, she remained an outsider in the world that had shaped Alexander's values and expectations. She watched helplessly as Vivian began to weave her web around her husband, using their shared past and his financial desperation to draw him into increasingly frequent private meetings that were ostensibly about business but felt like betrayals of their marriage vows. The pregnancy that should have been a source of joy became instead a burden that Isabella carried alone. Her growing body a constant reminder of the child who would inherit a legacy of emotional coldness and financial uncertainty. Alexander showed no interest in her condition beyond ensuring that she received proper medical care. Treating her expanding waistline with the same detached concern he might show for a prize mare expected to produce a valuable foal. It was during her 4th month that disaster struck with the sudden violence of a summer thunderstorm. Isabella woke in the pre-dawn darkness to find her nightgown soaked with blood, her body racked with pains that spoke of loss and devastation beyond her ability to comprehend. The physician who attended her confirmed what her heart already knew. The child she had carried with such hope and trepidation was gone, leaving behind only emptiness and a grief so profound that it threatened to consume her entirely. When Alexander was summoned to her bedside, his response to the tragedy was as coldly practical as his reaction to the pregnancy had been. He stood at the foot of her bed, like a military commander receiving a casualty report, his face betraying no emotion beyond mild disappointment at an inconvenient setback. "It's unfortunate," he said with the same tone he might have used to discuss a failed crop or a lame horse. "But these things happen. We are both young, and there will be other children when you have recovered your strength." Isabella stared at him through eyes swollen with tears and disbelief, searching his aristocratic features for some trace of shared sorrow or human compassion. But Alexander's emotional walls remained as impregnable as the battlements of his ancestral castle, protecting him from the messy complications of genuine feeling while leaving her to drown in an ocean of grief and isolation. "Yes, Your Grace," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the sound of rain against the windows. "I am certain you are correct." In the weeks that followed, Isabella threw herself into charitable work among London's poor with the desperate intensity of a woman seeking to fill the void left by her lost child and absent husband. She visited workhouses and orphanages, bringing food and medicine to families who had nothing, finding in their gratitude the human connection that her marriage had failed to provide. Through these activities, she began to learn about London's hidden neighbourhoods, the maze of narrow streets and crowded tenements where people survived through mutual aid and stubborn determination. She met women who had lost everything, yet somehow found the strength to rebuild their lives, children who faced each day with courage that shamed the complaints of the wealthy, and men who maintained their dignity despite circumstances that would have broken weaker souls. It was during one of these charitable expeditions that Isabella first glimpsed the possibility of a different kind of existence, a life where her worth was measured not by her dowry or her breeding potential, but by her actions and her character. The knowledge was both liberating and terrifying, opening doors to possibilities that she had never dared to imagine, while simultaneously highlighting the prison that her marriage had become. The final blow came at the Duke of Wellington's grand ball, where Isabella overheard Lady Vivian holding court among a group of society's most influential women. The widow's voice carried clearly across the crowded ballroom as she regaled her audience with observations that cut through Isabella's remaining defences like a sword through silk. "The Duke's little merchant wife is charming enough in her way," Vivian said with the casual cruelty of a woman secure in her own superiority. "But she will never truly belong in our world, no matter how perfectly she mimics our mannerisms. Alexander still comes to me for the intellectual companionship she cannot provide, the sophisticated discourse that only shared breeding and education can create." The words struck Isabella like physical blows, each syllable carefully chosen to inflict maximum damage upon her already fragile sense of self-worth. Yet instead of crumbling beneath the assault, she felt something unexpected stirring within her breast. Not despair, but a cold, clean anger that burned away the last vestiges of her romantic illusions. She lifted her chin with a pride that had been forged in the fires of disappointment and betrayal, her amber eyes meeting Vivian's violet gaze with unflinching directness. "You are quite correct, Lady Ashford," she said with a composure that surprised even herself. "I shall indeed never belong to your world, for which I find myself increasingly grateful. There are, after all, many different ways to measure a person's worth, and not all of them depend upon the circumstances of one's birth." The shocked silence that followed her words was broken only by the whispered conversations of those who had witnessed the exchange, their fans fluttering like the wings of startled birds as they processed the implications of what they had just heard. Isabella had not merely defended herself, she had thrown down a gauntlet that challenged the very foundations upon which their society was built. As she walked away from the confrontation with her head held high and her spine straight as a sword blade, Isabella felt the last chains of her old life falling away like autumn leaves. She was no longer the hopeful bride who had dreamed of winning her husband's love through patience and devotion. She was something new, something harder and more dangerous. A woman who had learned that survival sometimes required the courage to walk away from everything she had once believed she wanted. The war between them had begun in earnest, though Alexander remained blissfully unaware that his greatest battle would not be fought on foreign soil against enemy armies, but within the walls of his own home, against a woman whose love he had rejected and whose strength he had fatally underestimated. The autumn rain lashed against the windows of the Grosvenor Square townhouse with the fury of a woman scorned, each droplet striking the glass like tears shed for dreams that would never be fulfilled. Isabella hurried up the front steps, her dark blue pelisse soaked through despite the protection of her umbrella, her charitable visit to the Foundling Hospital having been cut short by the sudden violence of the storm that had swept across London like an omen of disasters yet to come. The butler who admitted her moved with the practiced efficiency of a servant, accustomed to his mistress's unpredictable schedule, taking her dripping outer garments without comment while she paused in the marble foyer to catch her breath. The house felt different somehow, charged with an electricity that had nothing to do with the lightning that illuminated the darkened sky beyond the tall windows. Isabella's amber eyes, sharpened by months of navigating the treacherous currents of society and marriage, detected subtle signs of disturbance in the usually perfect order of their domestic arrangements. Fresh flowers adorned the hall table, their exotic blooms speaking of expense and careful selection rather than the modest arrangements that typically grace their London residence. The scent of expensive French perfume lingered in the air, a fragrance that Isabella recognized with a sinking heart as belonging to Lady Vivian Ashford. The realization that Alexander's former mistress had been in their home, in the sanctuary that should have been sacred to their marriage, struck Isabella like a physical blow that left her gasping for breath. Moving with the silent grace of a woman who had learned to navigate hostile territory, Isabella made her way toward Alexander's study, drawn by the sound of voices that carried clearly through the partially open door. What she saw through that narrow gap shattered the last vestiges of her composure and destroyed whatever fragile hope she had managed to preserve despite months of emotional neglect and calculated indifference. Alexander sat behind his mahogany desk, his dark head bent close to Vivian's raven locks as they examined documents spread between them like battle plans. The widow's gloved hand rested possessively upon Alexander's forearm, her fingers tracing patterns against the fine wool of his coat sleeve with an intimacy that spoke of shared history and mutual understanding. Their conversation was conducted in the low, urgent tones of conspirators, their bodies angled toward each other in a way that excluded the rest of the world from their private communion. "You know I understand you in ways she never could, darling." Vivian's voice carried clearly through the crack in the door, each word falling upon Isabella's ears like drops of poison. "Your little wife is charming enough in her provincial way, but she lacks the sophistication necessary for ventures of this magnitude. These American shipping investments require a level of worldly knowledge that simply cannot be acquired through charitable work among the poor." Isabella's hand flew to her throat as if to contain the sob that threatened to escape her lips, her wedding ring catching the light from the corridor's gas lamps like a mockery of the vows that had bound her to a man who clearly found her presence not merely unwelcome, but actively burdensome. The casual cruelty of Vivian's assessment, delivered with the confidence of a woman secure in her superiority, confirmed every fear that had haunted Isabella's sleepless nights and lonely days. Alexander's response was lost in the thunder that rolled across London's rooftops, but his posture spoke volumes about his receptiveness to Vivian's counsel. He leaned forward with an eagerness that Isabella had never inspired, his grey eyes bright with an interest that her own attempts at conversation had never kindled. The contrast between his animated engagement with his former mistress and his cold indifference toward his wife was so stark that Isabella felt her remaining illusions crumble like ancient parchment exposed to flame. Retreating to her sitting room with the stealth of a wounded animal seeking shelter, Isabella sank into the rose silk chair by the window and stared out at the storm-lashed street below. The rain that streaked the glass seemed to mirror the tears that she refused to shed, each droplet a testament to the emotional devastation that threatened to consume what remained of her battered heart. She had known that Alexander did not love her, had accepted that their marriage was a business arrangement devoid of romantic sentiment, but witnessing his obvious preference for another woman's company was a humiliation that cut deeper than any blade. The sound of Vivian's departure, marked by the rustle of silk skirts and the click of expensive heels against marble floors, brought no relief to Isabella's torment. If anything, the knowledge that Alexander's former mistress felt comfortable enough to visit their home openly, to conduct business meetings that excluded his wife while including intimate touches and endearments, only served to emphasize the precarious nature of Isabella's position in her own household. It was while she sat in this state of emotional devastation that the urgent knocking at the front door announced the arrival of news that would transform her private anguish into public catastrophe. The messenger, who stood dripping on their doorstep, bore the black-bordered letter that would shatter what remained of Isabella's world, his solemn expression speaking of tragedy before he ever opened his mouth to deliver his grim tidings. Sir Edmund Fairfax was dead, struck down by an apoplectic fit while reviewing financial documents in his study, his body discovered by servants who had grown concerned when he failed to appear for his morning appointments. The circumstances of his death, surrounded by ledgers and correspondence that spoke of mounting debts and failed investments, painted a picture of a man driven to his grave by the weight of financial ruin and the knowledge that his schemes had finally collapsed around him like a house built upon sand. Isabella received the news with a composure that surprised even herself, her months of emotional battering having taught her to armor herself against fresh assaults upon her already wounded spirit. Yet beneath her calm exterior, guilt gnawed at her conscience like a cancer, whispering that her father's death was the direct result of the financial pressures created by her marriage and the impossible promises he had made to secure her future. The journey to her childhood home felt like a descent into purgatory, each familiar landmark serving as a reminder of happier times when her father's love had been the one constant in her uncertain world. The house that had once represented security and warmth now stood as a monument to shattered dreams and broken promises, its windows dark and unwelcoming, as if the very building mourned the loss of its master. The task of sorting through Sir Edmund's papers revealed the full extent of the disaster that had been brewing beneath the surface of their seemingly prosperous existence. Document after document told the same devastating story. Investments in American cotton that had failed when post-war markets collapsed, loans secured against assets that had already been mortgaged multiple times, and promissory notes that represented nothing more than desperate attempts to stave off inevitable ruin. The textile warehouses that had served as collateral for Isabella's dowry payments had been seized by creditors weeks before Sir Edmund's death, leaving behind only worthless paper and the hollow mockery of a fortune that had never truly existed. The £30,000 that Alexander had received upon their marriage represented the last of Sir Edmund's liquid assets. Money borrowed against the promise of future payments that could never be made. Isabella's hands trembled as she discovered the final, most damning piece of evidence, a letter from Sir Edmund's banker, dated just days before his death, informing him that his creditors were demanding immediate settlement of all outstanding debts, and that failure to comply would result in criminal prosecution for fraud. The knowledge that her father had died knowing himself to be a ruined man, facing the prospect of debtor's prison and public disgrace, filled Isabella with a grief so profound that it threatened to consume her entirely. The arrival of Mr. Pembroke, Sir Edmund's solicitor, brought no comfort to Isabella's torment. The elderly gentleman's usually cheerful demeanour had been replaced by an expression of grave concern that spoke eloquently of the legal complications that would follow in the wake of Sir Edmund's financial collapse. His carefully chosen words painted a picture of disaster that extended far beyond mere monetary loss to encompass the complete destruction of everything Isabella had believed about her family's position in the world. "I fear the situation is most grave, Your Grace," Mr. Pembroke said, his voice heavy with the weight of unwelcome revelations. "Your father's creditors are demanding immediate payment of debts totaling nearly £100,000, secured against assets that have already been liquidated or seized. The baronetcy itself was purchased with borrowed funds, and there is some question as to whether the title can be maintained given the circumstances of Sir Edmund's death." The implications of his words struck Isabella like hammer blows, each revelation more devastating than the last. Not only had she brought nothing of value to her marriage, but she had actually burdened Alexander with debts that could destroy even his ancient family's fortune. The knowledge that she was not merely worthless as a wife, but actively dangerous to her husband's financial survival, filled her with a shame so profound that she could barely meet the solicitor's sympathetic gaze. "What of my obligations to the Duke of Ravenshollow?" Isabella asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "The promissory notes that were provided as security for the remaining dowry payments?" Mr. Pembroke's expression grew even more grave as he consulted his notes. "I fear those documents are entirely worthless, Your Grace. The assets against which they were secured no longer exist, and your father's estate lacks the funds to honour any of his commitments. Unless His Grace chooses to assume responsibility for these debts, which he has no legal obligation to do, you could face prosecution for your father's fraudulent representations." The spectre of debtor's prison loomed before Isabella like a nightmare made manifest, its shadow falling across her future with the finality of a death sentence. She had heard tales of the horrors that awaited those unfortunate enough to be imprisoned for debt, stories of families destroyed and lives ruined by the unforgiving machinery of English law. The knowledge that her own fate hung in the balance, dependent upon the mercy of a husband who had already made clear his contempt for her very existence, filled her with a despair that threatened to overwhelm her remaining reserves of strength. It was while waiting in Alexander's study to confess the full extent of her father's deception that Isabella's attention was drawn to the display case that housed his military commendations. The medals gleamed in their velvet-lined box like stars fallen to earth, each one a testament to courage and sacrifice that humbled her own petty concerns. A letter from the Duke of Wellington, framed and displayed with obvious pride, praised Alexander's heroism at Waterloo in terms that spoke of genuine admiration and respect. The words painted a picture of a man who had charged into the very jaws of death to save his comrades, who had held his position against overwhelming odds while lesser men fled in terror. Isabella read of his promotion to colonel on the field of battle, of his role in the cavalry charge that had broken Napoleon's final assault, of wounds received in service to his country that had left him scarred in body and soul. The realization that she was married to a genuine hero, a man who had sacrificed his youth and his peace of mind in defense of England's freedom, only served to emphasize her own unworthiness. What right did a merchant's daughter, the child of a fraudulent bankrupt, have to bear the name of such a man? How could she continue to burden him with her presence when she had already brought him nothing but debt and disappointment? The sound of Alexander's return from his club interrupted her tortured reflections, his familiar footsteps in the corridor outside serving as a countdown to the moment when she would have to confess the full extent of her family's disgrace. She steeled herself for the confrontation that would surely follow, knowing that whatever remained of their marriage would not survive the revelation of Sir Edmund's fraudulent schemes and her own complicity in the deception. Yet when Alexander entered his study, his expression already dark with the news of Vivian's latest financial disaster, Isabella found herself unable to speak the words that would complete her humiliation. The investment scheme that had seemed so promising, the American shipping venture that was to have restored his fortunes, had collapsed in spectacular fashion, taking with it the last of his liquid capital and leaving him facing the same spectre of financial ruin that had driven her father to his grave. The entire enterprise was fraudulent, Alexander said, his voice hollow with the shock of betrayal. The ships existed only on paper. The cargo manifests were forgeries, and the profits that Vivian promised were nothing more than elaborate lies designed to separate fools from their money. Isabella watched as the man she had married, the war hero who had faced Napoleon's finest without flinching, struggled to comprehend how completely he had been deceived by a woman who had used his own pride and desperation against him. The irony was not lost on her that, while she had been torturing herself with guilt over her father's deceptions, Alexander had been walking blindly into a trap set by the very woman whose sophistication and worldly knowledge he had valued above his wife's practical wisdom. The moment stretched between them like a taut wire, vibrating with unspoken accusations and mutual recriminations. Isabella knew that she should confess her own family's financial collapse, should add her burden of shame to his already overwhelming load of disappointment and betrayal. Yet the words stuck in her throat like shards of broken glass, too painful to voice and too devastating to keep silent. Instead, she made a decision that would change both their lives forever. Rising from her chair with the dignity of a queen ascending the scaffold, Isabella looked into Alexander's storm-grey eyes and saw reflected there the same despair that had driven her father to his grave. In that moment, she understood with crystalline clarity that their marriage had become a prison for them both, a cage built from duty and financial necessity that trapped them in a cycle of mutual destruction. "I shall not add to your burdens, Your Grace," she said, her voice steady despite the chaos raging within her heart. "You have quite enough to concern yourself with without the additional complications that my presence brings to your life." That night, while Alexander drowned his sorrows in brandy and self-recrimination, Isabella sat at her writing desk and composed 2 letters that would seal both their fates. The first was a confession of her father's financial deceptions, a detailed accounting of the worthless promissory notes and non-existent assets that had formed the foundation of their marriage contract. The second was her farewell, a document that would free Alexander from the burden of a wife who had brought him nothing but debt and disappointment. Her personal jewelry, the few pieces that had belonged to her mother and represented the only assets she could claim as truly her own, were carefully packed and prepared for sale. The contacts she had made through her charitable work, the network of working-class families who had shown her kindness when society had shown her only contempt, would provide the refuge she needed to disappear into London's vast anonymity. As dawn broke over the city, painting the sky in shades of rose and gold that mocked the darkness in her heart, Isabella took one last look at the bedroom that had been both sanctuary and prison. The connecting door to Alexander's chambers remained closed and locked, a barrier that had never been breached by love or understanding, only by duty and the grim necessities of their arranged marriage. With steady hands, she placed her letters upon Alexander's desk and walked away from the only life she had ever known, carrying nothing but the clothes on her back and the bitter knowledge that sometimes love meant having the courage to set the beloved free, even when it meant destroying oneself in the process. The rain had stopped, and London awakened to a world washed clean by the storm, its streets gleaming with promise and possibility. Yet for Isabella Fairfax, the woman who had briefly been a duchess, the sun would never shine quite as brightly again, for she had learned that some sacrifices, once made, could never be undone, and some wounds, once inflicted, would never fully heal. The silence in Isabella's chamber was a gaping wound, far more agonizing than the thunder of cannons or the screams of dying men Alexander had known. He stood amidst the delicate furnishings, a stranger in a room that now felt like a mausoleum of lost hopes. Her letters, crumpled in his fist, were not merely paper. They were the shattered fragments of his very existence, her farewell, a death knell for the man he had believed himself to be. For the first time since Waterloo, Alexander Blackwood, Duke of Ravenshollow, the unshakable hero, felt utterly, irredeemably lost. The air, once scented faintly with hothouse roses and the elusive essence of his duchess, now held only the stark perfume of absence, cold and biting. Days bled into weeks, each sunrise a cruel mockery, each sunset a deepening despair. Isabella's absence was a phantom limb, an ache so profound it consumed his very soul. He found himself haunting the breakfast room, his gaze fixed on the empty chair where she once presided with quiet grace, half expecting to hear the rustle of her gown, the clear cadence of her voice. The grand halls of Ravenshollow, once merely echoes of his family's proud past, now felt dead, suffocated by the heavy shroud of her departure. He reached for her in his sleep, his hand finding only cold sheets, a visceral emptiness that brought him bolt upright, gasping for breath. His nightmares, those relentless furies of Waterloo, returned with a vengeance, but now intertwined with the carnage and the screams was Isabella's face, fading, unreachable, consumed by the same darkness that had swallowed his fallen comrades. She was no longer just a woman. She was the last bastion against the chaos within him, and he had foolishly, arrogantly cast her away. It was in this vortex of despair that Lord Marcus Whitfield, Alexander's closest friend and fellow war veteran, arrived like a beacon through the gathering storm. Marcus found the Duke in a state of complete disarray, a sight that would have been unthinkable mere months ago. Alexander's once immaculate clothes were rumpled, his dark hair dishevelled, and his eyes, those steel-grey orbs that had faced down Napoleon's cavalry without a flicker, were now haunted pools of grief and sleeplessness. "Alex, what in God's name has happened to you?" Marcus demanded, his voice sharp with concern as he took in the wreckage of his friend. The study, usually a bastion of military precision, was littered with discarded papers, empty brandy glasses, and a thick layer of dust. Alexander merely gestured vaguely at the letters on his desk. "She is gone, Marcus. She has left me." His voice was raw, stripped of all ducal pretense, the voice of a man broken. Marcus picked up one of the letters, his brow furrowing as he read Isabella's dignified but heartbreaking words. He looked from the letter to Alexander, a storm of anger and pity brewing in his own gaze. "You've been a fool, Alex. A damned unmitigated fool." He flung the letter back onto the desk. "That woman loved you, or at the very least, she was prepared to. And you, in your arrogant pride, in your crippling fear of feeling anything, you threw it all away. She was the best thing that ever happened to you, and you were too blind, too stubborn to see it." The words, brutal and unflinching, struck Alexander with the force of a cannonball, shattering the last fragments of his self-deception. He reeled, not from the verbal assault, but from the searing truth of it. His pride, his duty, his carefully constructed emotional walls, they were nothing but a prison he had built for himself, and Isabella had been the only one with the key. "What do I do, Marcus?" Alexander whispered, a plea so nakedly desperate it would have once been anathema to his very being. "How do I find her? How do I fix this?" Marcus, seeing the genuine remorse and profound pain in his friend's eyes, softened slightly. "You start by admitting you were wrong, truly wrong, and then you move heaven and earth to find her." He clapped Alexander on the shoulder. "I'll help you. I've made some good investments since the war, unlike your recent misadventures. We'll find her, Alex." Later that day, alone once more, Alexander found himself drawn to the portrait gallery. He stood before the monstrous canvas of his father, the 5th Duke of Ravenshollow, whose cruel beauty mocked him from the gilded frame. The eyes, so similar to Alexander's own, seemed to bore into his soul, a chilling reminder of the legacy he had inherited. In his desperation, Alexander finally confronted the source of his crippling inability to love, to connect, to be vulnerable. He recalled specific instances from his childhood, being locked in the dark, damp castle dungeon for showing affection to a stray kitten, the terrified whimpers of the animal mirroring his own silent sobs, the sting of his father's cane across his back for daring to cry at his mother's funeral, his father's icy pronouncement that emotion is weakness, fit only for women and fools. He saw how his father had systematically stripped him of any capacity for tenderness, believing it would make him strong, make him a true Blackwood. And in that moment, Alexander realized with sickening clarity that Isabella's gentle affection, her unassuming competence, her very light, had been the first genuine affection he had ever received, the first ray of warmth that had threatened to thaw the ice around his heart. And he, like a wounded animal, had instinctively recoiled, pushing away the very thing that could save him. The search began with a ruthless intensity Alexander usually reserved for military campaigns. He engaged the most discreet investigators in London, scattering them across the city like spies seeking an elusive enemy. But his initial instructions were flawed, born of his own prejudiced assumptions. "Look in the more respectable boarding houses, the establishments fitting for a woman of her former station," he had commanded, still unable to fully grasp the depth of Isabella's independence and the sheer breadth of her charitable connections. The reports came back fruitless, a parade of false leads and tantalizing near misses. One investigator claimed to have seen a woman matching Isabella's description in a fashionable Bloomsbury Square, but the sighting proved to be a socialite on a morning stroll. Another, a particularly unscrupulous sort, tried to extort money from Alexander, claiming to have information about Isabella's whereabouts, only to disappear with a substantial sum, leaving behind a fabricated story that left Alexander feeling even more violated. Marcus, observing his friend's growing desperation, quietly took over the financial management of the search, ensuring funds were distributed wisely and traps avoided. During this grueling investigation, Alexander, with Marcus's aid, began to piece together the true scope of Isabella's life outside the gilded cage of their marriage. He spoke to Mrs. Pemberton, the stern housekeeper, who, with a rare softening of her features, recounted Isabella's tireless efforts to implement new accounting systems, negotiate better prices with suppliers, and organize the chaotic household staff, saving Ravenshollow significant sums. He received reports from the estate manager, Mr. Hartwell, detailing Isabella's personal visits to tenant cottages, her practical advice on drainage systems, her donations of her own money for roof repairs, and her surprising knowledge of agricultural improvements. The tenants themselves, initially wary of the Duke's inquiries, spoke of the Duchess with genuine affection, calling her a blessing, a true lady of the people, crediting her with restoring hope to their lives. Alexander, reading these reports, felt a profound shame wash over him. His wife, the merchant's daughter he had dismissed, had done more to save his ancestral home with her quiet competence than his own desperate, misguided financial dealings. Her cost-saving measures and improved efficiency had actually stabilized the estate's finances more effectively than the dowry he had so eagerly pursued. Weeks bled into months, each passing day etching deeper lines of strain on Alexander's face. He neglected his appearance, his impeccably tailored coats hanging loosely on his frame, his dark hair often falling across his haunted eyes. His business affairs, already precarious after Vivienne's disastrous scheme, suffered further from his singular obsession. His war trauma, once muted by Isabella's unwitting presence, intensified without her calming influence. The vivid horrors of Waterloo returned not just in sleep, but in waking moments, triggered by the slightest noise or shadow. Marcus, witnessing his friend's rapid decline, began to genuinely fear for his sanity, recognizing the dangerous edge Alexander was teetering on. It was during one such moment of vulnerability that Lady Vivienne Ashford, always attuned to opportunity, made her move. She appeared at Alexander's townhouse, dressed in a daring gown of deep crimson, her violet eyes glinting with predatory sympathy. She attempted to console him, her gloved hand resting lightly on his arm. "My poor dear Alexander, such a tragedy to lose a wife of such limited understanding. It merely proves she was never truly worthy of you, does it not? Some women simply cannot endure the demands of our world." She leaned closer, her perfume a cloying cloud around him. "But you and I, Alexander, we understand each other. We always have. Perhaps now, with this unfortunate business behind us, we can resume what was once so natural between us." Her hand began to trace a familiar path up his arm. Alexander recoiled as if burned. The touch that had once offered fleeting comfort now felt like a viper's coil. He stared at Vivienne, truly seeing her for the first time in months. Not as a sophisticated equal, but as a manipulator, a cruel reflection of his own past mistakes. The very suggestion that she could replace Isabella, that she could ever understand the raw, aching void in his soul, ignited a furious rejection within him. "Lady Ashford," he said, his voice a low, dangerous rumble that sent a shiver down Vivienne's spine. "Your presence here is unwelcome. Our association, both personal and professional, is at an end. I require nothing further from you." His eyes, now blazing with a cold fury she had rarely witnessed, dismissed her with a finality that left no room for doubt. As she retreated, stung and humiliated, Alexander realized with a clarity that hit him like a physical blow. It wasn't just Vivienne he was rejecting. It was the entire superficial, calculating world he had inhabited. It was Isabella, his gentle, intelligent, strong Isabella, who held the key to his redemption, the only woman he could ever truly love. The breakthrough, when it came, was not through the meticulously managed investigations, but through a stroke of unexpected grace. Alexander, following a faint lead from one of Isabella's charitable society contacts, found himself in a forgotten corner of Whitechapel, a maze of narrow, grimy streets bustling with the working poor. There, in a small, crowded clinic run by a determined doctor, he found a young woman named Ilara, whose child Isabella had helped nurse through a severe illness months ago. Ilara, her eyes wide with a mixture of fear and profound gratitude, recognized the Duke from his previous visits to the Charitable Society headquarters. Moved by his obvious desperation, the raw, unmasked grief in his eyes, she risked everything. The kind Duchess. She taught me how to find work, how to survive in this city, Ilara whispered, her voice barely audible above the street din. She said if ever I needed help, I could ask for a position at the house of Mrs. Henderson in Lambeth. She herself works there, as a governess. Alexander's heart leapt, a frantic drum in his chest. Lambeth! It was a modest, respectable district, far from the fashionable squares he had searched. He rode through the night, the urgency of his quest, burning away the last vestiges of his exhaustion. As dawn painted the sky in shades of bruised purple and grey, Alexander arrived at a respectable but unpretentious terraced house in Lambeth. His knock, usually firm and authoritative, was tentative, almost pleading. When the door opened and a modest maid answered, Alexander, Duke of Ravenshollow, the hero of Waterloo, asked in a voice he barely recognized, "Is Mrs. Henderson at home? And might I inquire if she has a governess in her employ?" He was led into a small, neat parlour, his heart hammered against his ribs like a trapped bird. And then she entered. Isabella. She stood framed in the doorway, dressed in a simple, unadorned grey gown, her auburn hair pulled back severely in a sensible bun, a pair of spectacles perched on her delicate nose. She was thinner than he remembered, a faint pallor beneath her skin, but her amber eyes, those intelligent, fiery eyes, still held their captivating depth. She looked up, and her gaze met his. Her face, usually so composed, drained of all colour, her jaw dropping almost imperceptibly. Alexander, the epitome of aristocratic perfection, stood before her dishevelled, his dark hair falling across a face etched with weeks of sleeplessness and despair, his once impeccable coat wrinkled, his eyes haunted, a ghost of his former self. His usual perfect composure was utterly, spectacularly shattered. The silence stretched between them, thick with unshed tears and unspoken accusations, the dawn light filtering through the window, illuminating the raw, undeniable truth of their intertwined destinies. The small parlour in Mrs. Henderson's humble Lambeth home crackled with an electricity more potent than any storm that had ever raged across the moors. Isabella stood rooted, her simple grey governess's dress suddenly feeling like the rags of a street urchin before a king, yet it was Alexander who seemed to have fallen further. He stood before her, not the impervious duke she had married, but a man ravaged by desperation, his once impeccable attire now rumpled and travel-worn, his face gaunt, his eyes haunted hollows in a landscape of despair. He was still, even in his brokenness, the most magnificent man she had ever seen, and the contrast between their current circumstances and their former exalted roles was a silent, searing accusation. "Alexander," Isabella managed, her voice barely a whisper, yet it vibrated with a lifetime of unspoken hurt. "Why are you here? Have you come to secure your reputation, to drag me back to a life that had become a gilded cage?" Her amber eyes, usually so keen and clear, were now shadowed with suspicion, guarding against another devastating blow. He took a hesitant step forward, his hands reaching out, then falling uselessly to his sides. "Reputation?" His voice was raspy, laced with a raw emotion she had never heard. "What reputation remains when the very foundation of my existence has crumbled? I am here, Isabella, because I cannot breathe without you, because the silence of Ravenshollow is a torment, and the memory of your absence a constant agony." Years of suppressed emotion, of pride and pain began to pour from him, a torrent held back by a dam that had finally, irrevocably, burst. "You accused me of coming only for my name, my station. But what of my losses, Alexander? What of your fraudulent schemes that cost you what little capital you had left? Did you think I was so ignorant that I would not know? Did you believe I would burden you further with a wife who brought nothing but debt and deceit to your already failing estate? The words tumbled out, sharp and bitter, reflecting every sleepless night she had spent agonizing over his ruin, believing herself the cause. Alexander flinched, the accusations hitting him hard, but he met her gaze, a flicker of pain in his own eyes. "I know of Vivian's treachery, Isabella. I know of her fraudulent shipping ventures that stripped me of what little liquid assets I possessed. And I know the truth about your father, about the promissory notes and the debts." His voice dropped to a barely audible rasp. "I found your letters. Both of them." Isabella gasped, her hand flying to her mouth, a wave of mortification washing over her. She had poured out her heart, her shame, her plan for his freedom onto those pages. The thought that he had read them, that he knew the full extent of her family's disgrace, was unbearable. "I can't sleep, Isabella," Alexander confessed, his voice thick with unshed tears, his aristocratic facade completely shattered. "I can't eat. I can't think of anything but you. Every shadow in Raven's Hollow whispers your name. Every quiet corner screams your absence. You said I told you that you would never be enough, but the truth is, I can't live a single day without you. I was a fool, Isabella, a proud, stubborn fool who threw away the most precious thing in his life." He took another step, his eyes pleading, vulnerable, revealing a depth of suffering that mirrored her own. The nightmares, the screams of Waterloo, they returned with a vengeance after you left. They haunted me, not just of dying men, but of losing you, of seeing you vanish into the fog, just as my peace vanished. Isabella watched him, her heart tearing at the sight of his raw pain. It was the first time she had seen him so utterly undone, so stripped of his armor. This was not the cold duke, but the traumatized soldier, the boy who had never been allowed to feel. "My father," Alexander began, his voice hoarse, "he taught me that emotion was weakness. He taught me that tenderness was a fatal flaw. From a young age, any sign of affection, any tear, any moment of vulnerability was met with discipline." He hesitated, a shadow of an old fear crossing his face before forcing the words out. "I once had a kitten, a small orphaned creature I found freezing by the stable. I loved it, Isabella. It was the only thing I had ever truly loved. My father found me cradling it, weeping after it died. He locked me in the castle dungeon for 3 days, telling me I was weak, a disgrace to the Blackwood name. He beat me for crying at my mother's funeral, telling me men do not weep. He wanted to mold me into an unfeeling weapon, a duke who felt nothing, desired nothing but duty. I pushed you away, Isabella, not because you were not enough, but because you were too much. Your goodness, your warmth, your intelligence, they terrified me. You threatened to thaw the ice around my heart, and I, like a fool, believed that keeping you at a distance would protect us both from the inevitable disappointment, the emotional devastation I was convinced I would bring upon you." Isabella stood frozen, the harsh reality of his childhood abuse painting a stark picture of the man he had become. Her heart ached for the boy he had been, for the duke who had carried such a heavy, invisible burden. But her own wounds were fresh, deep. "And what of my wounds, Alexander?" she retorted, her voice trembling but firm. "Did you think I felt nothing? To be told I was not enough, that our marriage was a transaction, to endure your indifference after losing our child? Did you not think it would break me? I believed I brought nothing but shame, nothing but a false dowry and deceit to your proud name. I believed my love was unwanted, that my very presence was a burden you had to bear." She took a breath, tears finally spilling from her eyes, hot trails down her cheeks. "But I learned, Alexander, I learned that my worth is not measured by my dowry or my title. My worth is in my mind, in my spirit, in my ability to survive. My work as a governess, teaching children who need patience and kindness, has shown me that I have value beyond anything your world could offer or deny." A profound silence descended, broken only by Isabella's quiet sobs. Alexander watched her, the truth of her words piercing his very soul. He had been so consumed by his own pain, his own pride, that he had failed to see the strength, the resilience, the incredible heart of the woman he had married. "Isabella," he whispered, his voice full of a tenderness she had never heard from him before. I know you brought me debt. I also know that your efforts at Ravenshollow, your quiet brilliance, your management of the estate, they saved us more money than any dowry could have provided. Mr. Hartwell, Mrs. Pemberton, the tenants, they speak of you with a reverence I have never known. You brought life back to a dying estate, warmth back to cold stone. You did more than fulfill your duty. You surpassed every expectation I never dared voice. He finally took the last few steps, closing the distance between them. He knelt before her, heedless of his dignity, taking her trembling hands in his own. I remembered a moment, Isabella, at Waterloo, a young soldier, no older than your younger brother, dying in my arms. He looked so much like me, perhaps, in another life. I tried to save him, but I couldn't. His last breath was a whisper of his mother's name. I carried that moment, that helplessness, that guilt, for years. It fueled my coldness, my belief that if I cared for no one could be lost. But now, in your absence, I have realized the greater agony is to live without caring, to push away the very people who can heal the deepest wounds. His eyes, brimming with unshed tears, pleaded for understanding. Help me, Isabella. Please, help me heal. Isabella, looking into his raw, vulnerable eyes, saw past the Duke, past the war hero, to the man, broken and desperate, who finally dared to ask for solace. She felt a profound shift within her, not just pity, but a surging, undeniable wellspring of love, stronger and more resilient than ever before. Her gentle response, a soft squeeze of his hands, was not just forgiveness. It was the foundation of a deeper connection, a silent promise that vulnerability was not weakness, but the very foundation of true strength. The reconciliation, however, was not immediate, nor was it easy. Isabella, though moved by his confession, had learned too much, suffered too deeply, to simply return to a life dictated by his whims. She demanded proof, not just of his words, but of his actions. Alexander, for his part, understood. He had to court his own wife, not with gifts, but with dedication, with patience, with the daily, unwavering commitment that he had denied her for so long. He spent hours in the Lambeth parlour, listening to her speak of her day, watching her interact with her young charges, admiring her quiet competence. He sent flowers, not exotic blooms, but wild flowers picked from the countryside he now drove through, making the journey daily, just to spend a few precious hours by her side. He talked about his vision for Ravenshollow, but this time he asked for her input, sought her advice, not as a formality, but as a genuine partner. His ultimate act of public contrition came at the Duchess of Devonshire's grand ball, a glittering affair attended by the crème de la crème of London society. Isabella, though initially hesitant, agreed to attend, escorted not by Alexander, but by Marcus, allowing her to make her own entrance. Alexander, for once, arrived early. When Isabella entered, resplendent in a gown of deep emerald silk that shimmered like moonlight on dark water, her auburn hair artfully coiffed, every eye in the room turned to her. Alexander made his way through the throng, his gaze never leaving her. In front of London's elite, with Lady Vivian Ashford watching from across the ballroom, her face a mask of furious disbelief, Alexander Blackwood, Duke of Ravenshollow, took Isabella's hand. He held it up for all to see, his voice ringing with a conviction that silenced the whispers and turned every head. "Ladies and gentlemen," he announced, his eyes fixed solely on Isabella, "allow me to introduce my Duchess, Isabella Blackwood. Her unparalleled wisdom and profound contributions have saved Ravenshollow from ruin. And let it be known," he continued, his gaze sweeping the room, stopping pointedly at Vivian, "that I, Alexander, 6th Duke of Ravenshollow, am prepared to assume full responsibility for all of Sir Edmund Fairfax's debts. For the worth of this woman, my wife, far transcends any financial consideration." He then turned back to Isabella, his eyes softening to an agonizing tenderness. "I love you, Isabella, and I will spend the rest of my life proving that you are, and always have been, more than enough for me." A collective gasp rippled through the ballroom, followed by a smattering of applause, as shocked society absorbed the Duke's unprecedented public declaration. Vivian, her face contorted with rage, retreated from the ball, her defeat absolute. Back at Ravenshollow, the healing began in earnest. Alexander allowed Isabella to help him navigate the labyrinth of his war trauma. She listened without judgment as he recounted the horror of holding that dying young soldier at Waterloo, of his own desperate helplessness. Her gentle touch, the warmth of her understanding, slowly began to mend the deepest wounds of his soul. In turn, she shared her hidden fears, her quiet dreams, and together they began to build an emotional intimacy that had been tragically absent from their marriage. They developed a plan for the estate's restoration, a true partnership. Isabella's keen business acumen, her knowledge of textiles and supply chains, combined with Alexander's connections and renewed focus, transformed Ravenshollow. They established a textile operation on the estate, utilizing its own wool production, creating high-quality fabrics that quickly found favor in London. The enterprise not only generated significant revenue, finally putting Ravenshollow on solid financial footing, but also provided employment and improved living conditions for their tenants, fostering a sense of community and prosperity. While some members of the ton initially gossiped about their dramatic reconciliation, the couple's obvious happiness, their genuine respect for one another, and the visible prosperity of Ravenshollow gradually won over even their harshest critics. Their love story, once a subject of scandal, became a legend, inspiring other couples to seek genuine partnership rather than mere convenience. 2 years later, as a soft snow fell, dusting the ancient battlements of Ravenshollow Castle, the grand hall echoed with laughter and the joyful sounds of a Christmas celebration. Isabella, her heart full, watched as Alexander, his face no longer gaunt but filled with a profound peace, played with their spirited son, Alexander Jr., who was already showing signs of his father's determination, but, thankfully, his mother's warmth. A little girl, Mary, barely 2 years old, sat on Isabella's lap, absorbed in a brightly illustrated book. The castle, once cold and forbidding, now rang with warmth and life, a testament to their enduring love. The estate prospered, their charitable foundation flourished, a beacon of hope in the community, and their love had become the unwavering foundation for this new, beautiful generation. London society now whispered about them, not with gossip, but with genuine admiration, a true love story for the ages. Later that evening, as the last of the guests departed and the castle settled into a peaceful quiet, Alexander and Isabella sat by the roaring fire in their private chambers. He gently caressed her hand. "I almost lost the most precious thing in my life through pride, Isabella," he whispered, his eyes mirroring the dancing flames. "Love gave me the courage to confront the darkness within me, to become worthy of the extraordinary woman who saved my soul." He leaned closer, his lips brushing her temple, then her cheek, finally resting beside her ear. "You will always be more than enough for me, my love. Always." Isabella turned in his embrace, her amber eyes shining with a love that transcended all pain, all past. She knew, with a certainty that settled deep in her soul, that some promises, once truly made, truly believed, truly earned, lasted forever. As the snow continued to fall outside, blanketing the world in pristine white, their son, Alexander Jr., played with his toy soldiers in the nursery, while their daughter Mary nestled quietly beside her governess, absorbed in the pages of a storybook. A new generation, raised with love instead of fear, breaking the cycle of the Blackwood family's tragic past. Their future as bright and boundless as the love that had brought their parents together. And so, we close the final chapter of Alexander and Isabella's tumultuous journey, a tale woven with threads of pride, pain, and the unwavering power of a love that defied every expectation. We witnessed a duke, hardened by war and a brutal legacy, come face to face with his own emotional walls, discovering that true strength lies not in imperviousness, but in the courage to be vulnerable. And we saw a young woman, dismissed as mere new money, rise above societal scorn and personal devastation to reclaim her worth, her intellect and her heart, ultimately transforming not just her own life, but the very soul of the man she married. Their story is a powerful reminder that sometimes the greatest battles are not fought on foreign fields, but within the confines of our own hearts. It teaches us that true partnership is built on respect, understanding, and the willingness to see beyond surface appearances. It shows us that even in the darkest moments of betrayal and despair, hope can bloom, and that forgiveness, both for ourselves and for others, is the most profound act of love. Alexander and Isabella's journey proves that the love that truly conquers all is the one earned through shared trials, mutual growth, and the unwavering belief in another's boundless potential. We hope this passionate saga of the Waterloo Duke and his courageous Duchess has touched your hearts as deeply as it has ours. What emotions did their story awaken in you? What moments resonated most profoundly? We invite you to share your thoughts, your tears, and your triumphs in the comments below. And if you've stayed with us until this very last moment, please type the word "enough" in your comment. It's our secret signal, a way for us to know who truly embraced every twist and turn of this epic romance. And it helps us tremendously in bringing more stories like this to life. If this journey through Regency England has moved you, and you wish to support the dedicated team who poured their hearts into crafting every word, every emotion, consider sending a super thanks on YouTube. Every contribution, no matter the size, fuels our passion and allows us to continue creating these immersive worlds for you. And if a super thanks isn't possible, simply sharing this story with a friend, a family member, or anyone who cherishes a timeless love story is a gift beyond measure. Don't let the romance end here. We have many other captivating narratives waiting to sweep you away. You'll find links to similar tales in the cards above. Thank you for joining us on this unforgettable adventure. Until our next journey into the heart, remember, courage, vulnerability, and unwavering love can indeed heal all wounds.